I'm just waiting to be able, oh, there we go. All right. Okay, hopefully that should be nice and big for everyone. So thank you for the invite to come and talk today. I do have a rather new and somewhat loud puppy right next to me, so if he does start to go off and bark, I might have to mute temporarily. But let's see if we can get through an hour without that happening. I am Johnny Coates. I'm the newish Associate Director at ASAPbio. You can find me on Twitter, Mastodon, Threads, wherever you want to find me. My email's here if you have any questions that you'd like to get in touch with. And you can also find these slides linked here and the links at the end of this slide deck again. So I don't have to tell you what ASAPbio is because that introduction covered exactly what I was going to say perfectly. But the next slide kind of tells you, I think, why ASAPbio exists. As I'm sure all of you are very well aware, the academic publishing landscape is stuck in the pre-internet age. We've had the internet for almost my entire existence. And yeah, academia is still stuck in this age of print media. And there's two graphs on the slide that are some of my favorite graphs ever, which is a slightly nerdy thing to say. But this first one is showing you that in the 1980s, it took sort of just under 5 years for someone to get their first author paper published. And in 2012 to 2014, so almost 10 years ago, it took a year longer to get that first author paper. And a year might not sound like a lot of time, but it is a lot of time to an early career researcher. And that is a year that is now taking longer to actually get science and scientific findings out there and accessible. But my favorite graph yet is this one here. And what this is showing you, I think, is even more striking. And again, probably not something that is going to be much of a surprise to anyone. So in the 1980s, the number of panels in a manuscript was generally below 20. And this is the total number of panels in a manuscript. And then again, 2014, so 10 years ago, the number of panels kind of doubled, basically. And there's also this thing called supplemental material, which is just as big, if not bigger, than the total number of panels in an entire research article in the 1980s. And so the amount of data required to publish has just exponentially grown. It's ridiculous at the moment. And this is partly a good thing. It's a reflection that we've now got really cool new techniques like single-cell RNA-seq that gives you multiple different panels from a single experiment. But it also reflects a huge amount more work that's going in there. And this is kind of why I think this delay that we're seeing is happening. And this delay will only be getting worse as the number of panels gets worse. And so we really have to kind of think about how to untangle publishing. And publishing is these three arms. So you've got dissemination, you've got peer review, and then you've got the curation and prestige arm. And this is controlled by journals at the moment. And this current system motivates the sharing of a complete final story that is required for jobs, for funding, but it's not of the benefit to science or scientists, really. And so what we propose is that we want to shift away from that model to what this is the publish, review, curate, or PRC model. So we want to decouple these steps, and where we promote preprint use. So we're big advocates for preprints. And so we think that dissemination step should be preprinted work. You then peer review preprints. You do that openly and transparently. And then you can curate and look at that side of things with things like overlay journals. And by decoupling the system, you also then attack the prestige that is marked with things like impact factor and stuff like that, which we know is nonsense, basically. It's not very helpful to anyone. And instead, you shift the focus back onto the actual work that was done and the quality of the work that was done. So if you're not familiar with preprints, this is sort of the main side as to why preprints are so good. So what you're seeing is the bottom here is the normal step that we go through with submitting our manuscripts to journals. You submit your manuscript, a journal might outright reject it. You then have to submit it to another journal. It might go through revisions, it may then be accepted, it may still be rejected, goes to another journal. And you do this until eventually you satisfy the editor, the reviewer, and it eventually becomes published. That whole process takes between usually months to a couple of years sometimes to actually get your paper out in the public. Preprints, on the other hand, we're taking sort of bioRxiv here as an example, but within 2 days of submitting your manuscript to the preprint server, your preprint is public and people can read it, they can give you feedback, and you can actually start using that in your own research, whether that's to improve the manuscript or whether that's as a reader of preprints to come up with new ideas and drive your own research programs. And so that's totally different timescales we're working on. So preprints are not peer-reviewed by the survey before posting, but as we'll come on to, that does not mean they're poor quality. And they are usually subjected to some screening steps, but this does mean they are posted rapidly. Preprints are versioned, and this means you can easily update or correct them. I'm sure we've all done that thing where we publish a paper and then we find all of our mistakes and you can't change them. Preprints are compatible with most journals now, and you can check these really cool tools to actually check your journal of interest. They're citable, this is because they receive a DOI, and they're also pooled with in terms of citations from preprints and journal articles. So Google Scholar, for example, does this. They're also indexed, so you can find them on your PMC, for example. And many funders now consider preprints as evidence of productivity for grants applications and fellowship applications. And also hiring bodies are increasingly starting to view preprints as a valid output. And preprints have kind of exploded in recent years in terms of their use. So there's a long history that we're not covering here about preprints in the life sciences, and that dates right back to the 1960s. But really, our current version of preprints kind of established itself in sort of 2013 when bioRxiv was created and launched. It took a little bit of time for things to really take off, but then, as I'm sure everyone, again, is very aware, when the pandemic hit, preprints were just at the forefront of that. And thankfully, that kind of explosion in use of preprint servers seems to still be in place. We haven't lost that. And this increases every month. There's been a few key events happen in that time. The one I'm going to focus on, just to point out on this graph, would be eLife. It's the latest initiative on this model. And I'm not going to talk much about eLife. I'm going to talk about some of the different preprint review services a bit later on. But it's really cool to see main publishers switching up how they do things and trying out new models of publishing. So one of the big benefits to preprints is that they reduce some of the barriers to sharing. And this is I really like this graphic because I think it shows just how inaccessible science actually is. So what you're seeing here are the percentage of preprints that are published, and 65% of preprints that are published are actually published from the high income countries, whereas only 25% are published from the lower income countries. And I can tell you why this is from discussions I've had with people, but a lot of this is basically just the way the system currently works. It's not set up to be equitable. It's not set up to be accessible if you're not in a high income country. And preprints don't have any costs associated with them. So it's a great way of leveling the playing field a lot more and making things more accessible. And that's not just accessible in terms of reading, it's free to post. So you can share your research without having to pay fees, but you can also keep on top of the latest research without having to pay any fees, or belong to a library that is paying subscription fees for you. And as I said, a huge amount of the code research was actually released as preprints. In the first 10 months of the COVID-19 response, the entire literature, 25% of that literature was, 40% of that literature was preprint, which is, we'd never seen that before. And it was a great use of why it's important to get rid of these barriers that's taking so long to share science. We couldn't do that in a pandemic, and I would argue we shouldn't be accepting that in response to any disease or any solution we're trying to figure out a solution to. So if we look at these COVID-19 prints a little bit more, they were short, they were frequently updated compared to the non-COVID-19 preprints. And This is really getting at a different way of thinking about sharing a research findings. So sharing findings earlier, maybe when they're not actually a complete story, and updating it as you get data through. We saw that happening a little bit during COVID, and we've actually got a project at the moment looking at this in more depth outside of COVID. And it'd be great to see people do this more. I think people should iteratively update their work as they do it. The other thing we found with COVID and preprints is that preprints were beginning to shape policy. So we looked at a lot of policy documents before COVID and during COVID, and we couldn't really find any mention of preprints prior to COVID. But then suddenly we're seeing a lot of preprints being mentioned in COVID-related policy documents. And certainly from the UK aspect, these were things that directly shaped our lockdowns, for example. And these preprints during COVID received a huge amount of attention. I'm in London, so I would get on the tube because I still had to go to work. And you would hear people on the tube talking about preprints, which was madness because that's a level of interacting with science that I'd never seen before from the general public. And this was just not, so we did see citation levels go up, which is surprising, not surprising because obviously scientists were very interested in this at the moment, but the level of tweets went up for COVID-related preprints, and this really was a wide variety of people looking at them. They were used in news articles in a way they never had been before, and things like blogs as well. And this kind of gets to the question of peer review and quality, because if preprints are being used in policy documents to shape policy decisions, if they're being accessed by the layperson or by politicians, I think would be a particular one to highlight, there's a potential danger with that. And it's important before I talk about the evidence around peer review, this danger exists with peer-reviewed literature as well. It doesn't go away. And I'm only showing you one slide about data comparing preprints to peer-reviewed versions, but there is a lot of data now on this topic, and the data all points towards the same thing, which is that just because something is not peer-reviewed does not mean it is low quality. So this example here is from a paper where they were basically looking at confidence intervals between the preprint and its published version. And remarkably straight line here. Basically what they found was that although uncertainty is reduced during peer review, it's not a big reduction. And this is kind of the heart of what a lot of the data around this topic says, which is peer review is helpful mostly, but it's not revolutionary, it's not changing the key outcomes, it's just tightening things up a little bit. And my argument is that we really shouldn't be spending so much time and money and effort on a system where it's a small improvement. And despite that, people do have a lot of concerns about preprints. And some of the biggest concerns are around those things I've just spoken about. So it's sharing information before peer review. It is premature media coverage of preprints, or preprints undermining the value of peer-reviewed journals and things like that. And to kind of remedy this, we position ourselves that public feedback is the best way to challenge these things. Again, bringing it back to COVID, there were some really great examples of utter rubbish that was posted as a preprint. Utter rubbish also published in peer-reviewed journals, to point out, but the difference was that the rubbish that was published as a preprint was very quickly removed and withdrawn. This example, I think the turnaround was within 2 days. It was withdrawn from the preprint server. And so this is a very important mechanism for combating misinformation. And bioRxiv, just to highlight a single preprint server, does a really good job at integrating with feedback providers. So if you haven't used bioRxiv, you won't know, but if you have, this little toolbar here at the top of each preprint is great because the second box in is all about evaluation of the paper. So you're seeing an example here from eLife. So now eLife has switched their model. If eLife review a preprint, you can link to it directly from the preprint. If one of the other services, so Rapid Reviews or Review Commons reviews a preprint, it will also be linked out from there. This does also have things like Prelight, which is a preprint highlighting service, linked out through there. So it helps you get a bit of feel for the work and sometimes even place it into a bit of context if it's pre-light that's been written for example. But this toolbar also does a bunch of other things, and one of those things that links out to Twitter, and you can see any discussion that's happened on Twitter. Not something you find a lot with non-code preprints, but during code, Twitter was a great source of discussion around preprints, not always positive discussion. And we're talking about peer reviewers, and there's two elements to peer reviewers. There's the side that are the gatekeepers, and we've all experienced reviewer number two who has made our life a nightmare, asking for a huge number of revisions that aren't really necessary, or just not even understanding the paper. But this doesn't have to be peer review, because peer reviewers can also be collaborators. And Review Commons launched a little while ago now, but this is some early data. So this was 9 months into the launch of Review Commons, which is a platform that reviews preprints before they submit to journals. And then you can take those reviews with you when you submit your preprint to a journal. So it speeds up the whole process, and it means you don't have to wait around for another round of peer review from another set of peer reviewers. And what you're seeing on this slide is basically that people were very happy with the experience. And the thing I like to highlight when I present this data is this second section here. So reviews were collegial. And I think this is a big benefit of public and transparent peer review. And it's something that eLife's recent data on how their model is going also reflects, which is that public peer reviews are just nicer. And there's no reason we can't be nicer to each other in science. Doesn't mean they're not as helpful, they're just as helpful, but they're just written nicer. And I think it goes from, it's not a solution to the research culture issue, but it's a really good thing to have in there, and I sort of chip away at some of the nastiness that can be across academia. But the other thing that gets me excited about preprint peer review is that it opens up to a whole new space for experimenting with peer review. And this could be the authors selecting the reviewers. This could be the public doing a peer review. This could be a crowd doing a peer review. So we at ASAPbio have a fellows project going every year. One of the projects this year that the fellows are doing is a crowd review, and every 2 weeks we send a new preprint out to a crowd of 192 people signed up, and they can review a single panel in a figure, and then together you collect the crowd comments and you have a full peer review of a paper, of a preprint. And it just, the experiments are what we need at the moment to figure out where the future lies. eLife is another great example of preprint peer review experimenting. And when I'm talking about experimenting, this has also exploded in recent years. So the preprint feedback ecosystem, which is what you're seeing on this slide, is just huge now. It started off a while back with basically things like pre-lights and pre-review, quite old. But now you've got a whole bunch of other services that exist around providing feedback on preprints. Some of these are very much journal-like. So you've got your Review Commons, PCI, eLife is a journal. But these also go the other way, where it's much more free-form, and it's comments on PubPeer or comments across social media, which are also a form of peer review. And I haven't shown you this, but the number of preprint servers has also increased a great deal in the past few years. All of the major publishers own a preprint server of their own now, which kind of tells you that this is where they see the future going. And it's also, as I'm going to get onto, where governments see the future being. So we talked about preprints as part of this decoupling the journal dominated system here. So we've talked about dissemination, but what about peer review? And I could give you many slides on the different services that exist, but I'm just highlighting Review Commons here. So Review Commons, you have your preprint reviewed, it goes through one round of review. There's no decision made on whether it's going to be accepted or not in terms of the preprint. It's just a review on the work that was done. Review Commons is affiliated with a bunch of different journals. The PLOS journal family are one example. And then when you submit your preprint that has Review Commons reviews with it to one of those journals, they basically have agreed not to restart the review process. So You submit your preprint with the reviews. The journal has a look at those. They make a decision based on those reviews as to whether they want to accept or reject the paper. Oftentimes, the authors have already started the process of actually answering the peer reviewer questions. And so the whole system is sped up. And obviously, if it's a reject, you can then just go to another affiliate journal with those reviews. And this preprint review growth has been great to see because this has been a bit more recent for me. So you can see sort of 2017, 2018, there wasn't a lot of this, but certainly since 2020, well, since the end of 2020, really, the amount of reviewed preprints has just increased every year. We've got a bit of a dropout here because we collected this data earlier this year, so that's why we have a low of February 2023 and nothing after that. And this is also telling you that this is where the future is going towards. We're going towards peer-reviewed preprints. And as part of that, there's no point peer-reviewing a preprint if people don't recognize that. But in the past few years, we've seen a lot more efforts towards recognizing peer-reviewed preprints. So for an example, across France, there are 18 doctoral schools now that clearly and explicitly state preprints that have been peer-reviewed are considered the same as a published article. EMBO are also accepting peer-reviewed preprints for their fellowships, and this is a big part of Plan S. So you really fit into that open access, open science ecosystem, which is why I want to end this talk. So effectively, what I've just shown you is our version of Diamond Open Access, which is using preprints, transparent preprint peer review, and then what I didn't really talk about are the overlay journal aspect of that. So where do preprints and open science fit together? So the European Council recently released a call that effectively stated that they want a publishing model that is not for profit, open access, multi-format, but importantly, with no costs for the authors or readers. And as this whole talk has been about, a publish, review, curate system does that. And you're all in the US, so you're probably more familiar with this one than I am, but the Nelson memo, which is currently being debated quite a lot at the moment, basically said the same thing, which is that federally funded research should be freely available and publicly accessible without any embargo or delay. And again, a PRC system directly achieves that outcome. So I think that's the end. Yep, so that's the end. So you can find these slides through the link here if you want them, or feel free to send me an email if you want to ask anything additionally. But I think we have plenty of time for questions. So, yeah, so that's basically how it's currently working is they all have a preprint server, and it's very much a system where if you submit to them, they put it on their preprint server because it fulfills some of the open access mandates by doing so, and then it just goes through the normal process. So it's not that revolutionary. It might be quite cynical of me, but I would argue the reason they're buying them up is the reason publishers are buying up a lot of the the research in ecosystem, which is just control. Publishers own all of the metric systems that we rely on, and I think this is just another step in that. But it does help them out by fulfilling some of their open access mandates. Yes. Yeah, there are some publishers not doing that. So eLife is just the best example to give at the moment, because obviously their entire model has shifted. And one of the things we are thinking about trying to organise into next year is something based around, so basically trying to convince society publishers that they should adopt that model. Because we've kind of been waiting for someone to do something where they can lead the way and show that something different is profitable and it works, which is what eLife, so far, it's only 6 months, but so far that's what their data shows. And it's a way for societies to kind of shift themselves to a better way of doing things, which is one of our current aims.
So in that model, the societies are publishing or funding the operation just on the basis of subscription fees, or I guess membership fees from the members of the society?
Basically, we're kind of shifting what you're thinking about you're paying for, I guess. So traditional publishing, you're paying, I'm not sure what you're paying for in honesty, but you're paying for the paper, the journal name. Whereas what we're trying to advocate for is paying for the reviewer reports instead, right? Pay for the thing that actually the journals say is the big benefit to publishing, which is the peer review reports. So why don't we shift the thinking to doing that? And then it's not about the venue you're publishing, it's more about the work you've done and the quality of that work. Which is eLife, basically eLife's model.
I actually have a question as well. It seems like there's pretty good engagement with the review commons for preprints. I guess like how do you think that growth has happened? It seems like there's potential for a lot more scholar engagement with open review for preprints than maybe perhaps for like very specific journals that are trying out open review as like a new model. So you mentioned societies, but I'm wondering like where do you reach the reviewers and what kind of engagement would you say, like has it grown, that kind of thing, since like this effort in like review commons started? It's a long question.
Yeah. So all of the review services are seeing growth just with every month. They're also all putting a lot of effort into diversifying the reviewer pool, which is, again, is one of those benefits of decoupling the whole system. And so they're putting a lot of effort into focusing on getting reviewers who traditionally wouldn't do review, whether that's early career researchers or people from geographies where they're often excluded from these activities. And the thing I would like to see more of, and it is starting to happen again, some of these services are doing this, is shifting it, so not necessarily shifting the review, but bringing it into education of undergraduates and grad students. So instead of doing a journal club, for example, review a preprint and post that review publicly. So pre-review is a really great example of a service that allow you to do that, and that's one of the things they do. They put a lot of their effort into. So pre-review do a lot of live journal clubs or training in pre-review, and it's a great system of a group of people, it's how we do our crowd review, or individuals being able to post a public review of a preprint, which then gets uploaded on Society as well, so it gets about as much distribution as you can get. And it's just a nice system, it's a good system to get in there early on, and then if we can get in there early on with the students, it becomes normal, and hopefully that's how everyone will do it when they get their own labs.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how easy it is for people who are doing these reviews to get professional recognition for it. Since it's out in the open, I guess you can theoretically just show people the reviews you've been doing.
Yeah, so that's a discussion we've been having with all the different review services at the moment. It's not as straightforward as a lot of the traditional peer review people do, so that kind of goes straight onto ORCID, for example, and you get your recognition there. But as you said, it's in the public, so you can link to it. Society is a great tool in this because it brings all those things together. So in theory, what you could do is have your own list on Society of preprints that you reviewed and just link to that from like a CV or an application document, and it's all in one place. but it's a thing that is still being worked on at the moment to really expand that out.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for now. So thank you so much for your presentation.